Now, when you come to look at this notion of play, or even the notion of what might be called fun, we probably wouldn't find a welcoming home for that in a boardroom. Boardrooms are comfortable with the discussion of quantitative facts. They want to deal with things which are tangible and replicable and measurable. When we talk about fun, or we talk about love, or we talk about faith or confidence, these are things which boardrooms are not comfortable with, and this can be accounted to the experience and the culture of the boardroom.
That was Chris Lewis, author of Too Fast to Think, a best-selling book on reclaiming creativity in a hyper-connected work culture. This is episode 2 in a podcast series based on the book. Today's podcast explores creativity as a tool for problem-solving, the different types of intelligence, and how these influence the creative process, and how we need to measure creativity at the corporate level.
So the notion of creativity is a very interesting one. Many people chase this as some form of holy grail throughout their career. If you are a creative, it calls to you. It calls to you across the years, and it calls to you across the disciplines. Many people feel that they have failed unless they have creativity in their job title or an overt part of their job. That's because everybody has an innate ability and compulsion to solve problems. And this is where the creative process needs further scrutiny, because if creativity becomes just the provenance of those who are defined as creative, then it is to deny the profound effect that creativity can have as a tool for problem solving itself. When you take a class of 4-year-olds and ask who is an artist or who is creative, most people will put their hands up. If you ask them at the age of 14 about whether they're creative or an artist, only 1 or 2 will put their hands up. What's the difference between those two age groups? Well, one has had a large chunk of education and one is at the beginning of their education. This then forces us to examine the different types of intelligence, because intelligence is more than just the type that can be measured within the rubric of school. Gardner himself, as a writer on different types of intelligence, identified several different areas that one could be defined as being intelligent in. And to confine creativity just to a simple creative role doesn't really do its justice, because you can be as creative as a lawyer, as you can be as an accountant, as you can be as a copywriter or a film director. There are different types of creativity. There is kinetic-based creativity, for instance, people who can dance. There is cinematography for people that can make films. There is graphic design creativity. But there's also simple creativity amongst those who care, because when you're trying to find, for instance, the key to people's confidence, that is not a logical process, because it comes down to a set of beliefs. And one of the things that an overdeveloped Western reductionist world gives us is the ability to be critical of most things. Whenever confronted with change, many people are resistant to it and critical of it. This is not because they dislike change, it's because they can't control it. All the evidence points to the fact that when people are allowed to control change, they willingly embrace it because it's a natural part of their own creative process. People like to play. Now, when you come to look at this notion of play, or even the notion of what might be called fun, we probably wouldn't find a welcoming home for that in a boardroom. Boardrooms are comfortable with the discussion of quantitative facts. They want to deal with things which are tangible and replicable and measurable. When we talk about fun, or we talk about love, or we talk about faith or confidence, these are things which boardrooms are not comfortable with, and this can be accounted to the experience and the culture of the boardroom. Many people say they want their boardrooms to become creative, but we have to look at some of the prophylactics that exist around the creative process itself. For instance, creativity doesn't necessarily respond well to the short term. We know that the creative process itself involves induction and incubation before you get to ignition and implementation of ideas. The induction and incubation, if you were to look at it on a percentage basis, would probably constitute as much as 40 and 30% respectively. So the majority of our creative process is actually induction and incubation before we get to any form of epiphany or ignition. If that's the case, then we need to recognize that sometimes solving a problem cannot be done as a one-step process. It needs a period of gestation in order to get to the bottom of what the problem is. It needs to be tested intuitively. And what do we mean by the intuitive process? Well, sometimes when we look at how intuition works within a boardroom, it's something that people are very reluctant to rely upon. And this also points to the patriarchy, which dominates the culture of a lot of boardroom thinking. Even when there are equal split of genders on the boardroom, we can still be constrained by patriarchal thinking because of the inability to look beyond the current parenthesis of what's acceptable in a boardroom discussion. We can't be creative because being creative is not our job. I disagree. The primary job of the board is to be creative in thinking of solutions, to use its imagination to envisage what could be in the company, and also, importantly, to grant permission to the rest of the organization to behave in a way which is creative. What do creative people look like? How do we measure the presence of creativity in an organization? Well, this again is not something you can do necessarily with numbers, but what you can say is that it's very difficult for organizations to develop core competencies where there is no enjoyment or preference for those core competencies. Competence follows preference. But what do we mean by that? Well, simply that people can't get good at something they don't like doing. Most people who have developed a core competency, for instance, at school, often relate it to having a favorite teacher or somebody they actually liked working with, or a classroom environment which actually made them like the subject that they were taught. Many people have recoiled from a subject for the exact same reasons that they did not like the person or the way the subject was taught. Arguably, the same is true of the creative process. Many people have recoiled from it because of its intangibility and because of its difference to the Western reductionist process upon which they've been taught to rely. A sort of oil and water. One of the things we're going to talk about in the next session is how we can emulsify that oil and water with vigorous thinking, energy and dynamism to combine both the logic and the conceptuality that's innate in all of us.
Chris Lewis is founder and CEO of one of the largest independent marketing and communications agencies in the world. He is a journalist and author, including of the best-selling book, Too Fast to Think.